incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today, I'd like to talk about some things about practice that generally don't get mentioned much in terms of Zen practice. Let's start out with a comment by Harada Shodo-roshi. He said, the first 10 years are difficult. The next 10 years are difficult. And then it becomes easy. I'm not sure I'd agree with that 100%. I would say the first however many years are difficult. We don't know, it varies depending on the person. And basically the baggage we carry into practice and how easy it is for us to work with it. And then as we do continue to work with it, it does become easier. At first it seems to become much harder because of course we're becoming more aware of what we're carrying and how much pain it's causing. But I don't think it takes 20 years for it to become easy. And all along the way, after that first hump is gone beyond, it begins to get easier and more rewarding. There are what are known as the 3 pillars of Zen. I don't know if that was established by Mitra-roshi. It's the title of his book, The 3 Pillars of Zen, or if it's just a different way of naming 3 essential components to practice. And they really are essential. They're prerequisites to practice in a way. And that is great doubt, which is really more like great perplexity. And people come to practice because something's not right in their lives. It may just be an underlying sense of discontent or a disruption, or it could be a major thing, a death of someone close, or a major crisis in life, or something like that. And so we begin to wonder whether we really can trust the worldview that we have, and certainly our culture view. And we begin to have a sense perhaps that there's something more beneath current assumptions that may be valuable to return to. So that's great doubt. And then there is great faith. Without faith that we can open to something very much worth opening to. What we go through is going to be so challenging, usually, for most people it is, that we won't stick it out unless we have that deep faith that there really is something worth opening to. And then what puts it into play and makes it happen is this deep, dark, not dark, but deep determination. We have to have determination that will keep us going despite the odds, despite what we run into. That faith and determination are perhaps more important in a certain way than the perplexity, although the perplexity is also important as well. It's very interesting that in the Tibetan culture, apparently, as is similar to Japan, the group is the important part of things. The person, the individual, is not particularly important. And so people don't identify with their feelings. In fact, the language expresses it apparently quite well. If somebody gets angry, they say, there's anger. They don't say, I'm angry. And they certainly don't say, I'm angry at you because you did this to me. They say there's anger. It's a very different way of seeing emotions. And as you've heard if you listen to the last two Teishos, that there's a recent evidence that emotions are created as a result of conditioning. Now, of course, the Buddha discovered that one a long time ago. But modern psychology and modern science has begun to validate it. It really is true that our worldview comes out of our concepts, and our concepts drive our feelings, our emotions. A pretty interesting example of that is something that happened to me when I was in grade school. Normally, in grade school in Canada at the time, if we were not actively engaged in writing or reading, holding a book, for example, then we were to sit with our hands folded on the desk top like this. We're listening to the teacher speak, or we actually had, I think once a week, we had a radio broadcast of some sort during that time as well. Or if we'd finished our schoolwork and we're waiting for the next assignment or the next instruction, same thing, hands clasped on the top of the desk. And we also were not, it was desks in a row, it wasn't free classroom arrangements as there are nowadays. And in the row next to me, there was a little girl who was clearly deeply unhappy, very closed off. She just didn't interact, and there was a sense of great sadness and defeat about her. And as it turns out, she also had what was probably known as psoriasis. Her arms were full of, not sores, but the kind of scaly skin that is characteristic of psoriasis. And I suspect, from my experience and education more recently, she was probably abused as well. And so I reached over one day to touch her, as an expression of care and companionship. She freaked. She immediately started crying and told the teacher that I was hurting her. And she had completely misinterpreted my connection with her and my touch. And no doubt because of her own experiences having colored her view of the potential for danger and the potential for harm from other people, even other kids. We may have had experiences with this, with saying something to somebody that we might not have known very well, as a kindred soul. And the reaction from that person was quite unexpected and negative. You would sort of think, you would assume, that certainly Americans are part of the same culture. And so we would have the same feelings about the same things. And to a certain degree, that is true. But in another way, it's not at all true. Because it all boils down to our own personal experience and the conclusion we have drawn from those experiences. That's what drives our view of the world. And that's what creates our emotions about things. Harada Shodo-roshi, many years ago, decades ago, when he was still a training monk at Shofukuji, was one of the forehead monks at the monastery. Some of you have already heard this story. It is a true story. It was told to me by someone who was actually present at the time of this incident. And he was leading a work party outside the main gates of the temple, which was still on temple property. And many of the Japanese Zen temples have, or certainly had, extensive lands because they used to grow their own food and so on. And over the years, they've had to sell off properties in order simply to survive because of the Meiji Restoration. But there was some land around the outside of the temple walls at Shofukuji, and they had some work to do. So they were out there with some tools, shovels, and so on. I wasn't told exactly what work they were doing, but there was some sort of work. And on the property lived a group of homeless people. And yes, there are homeless people in Japan. There are people who don't fit in society for one reason or another, just as in America. And they often will band together and live together in small groups. And that was the case of this group at Shofukuji. And for whatever reason, they decided that the temple was doing them out of water and that they deserved to have this water, that it was their right to have this water. And so the leader of the group, who, my friend Daikatsu, who told me this story, said was not, clearly not a stranger to violence, came up to, he was called Dosan back then, and was absolutely in his face, livid, red, raging, screaming at Dosan. And Dosan, rather than reacting, Dosan simply was paying clear attention to this man and simply got more and more calm within himself. And there's something called entrainment in psychology, and it is something that this is how babies are taught culture, in a sense. Their primary caretaker and other caretakers, how they interact with the child, smiling, cooing, picking the child up, and engaging positively with this child. The child is being entrained with positive energy and learning how to be in this world, or at least the microcosm in which they were born. And entrainment, of course, can come in various different colors. Somebody is not picked up and cuddled and ignored largely. They develop a very different way of experiencing the universe, and they do not develop the human emotions that they would have had they been treated differently. But that's beside the point. So what was happening was, as Harada Roshi was getting more and more calm and still open to this man, the man himself was responding unwittingly by becoming more and more calm himself. It's interesting that when I was monitoring Sesshin in Rochester, the Rochester Zen Center, and particularly if I was a head monitor, and the group was lagging in energy and having trouble with focus and so on, I learned that if I increased my focus and concentration myself, the whole group followed suit. It's very interesting, this aspect of humanity, and it's also something that's been discovered, so to speak, by science, that we feel each other's feelings, that we tune into each other in subliminal ways and understand how we are feeling and how each other are feeling. Now, if someone has not had the kind of background as an infant where they were picked up and nurtured, then they don't develop that ability. Which is rather interesting, and they become what is known as psychopaths or sociopaths, unable to really have a sense other than a kind of a street sense of other people's feelings. They don't share them. This is getting a little bit astray, but it's in a way it isn't, because our very cultural assumptions that each one of us is central, and in general more central than any of the rest of us in the universe, has us very self-involved, and we assume that we are our feelings, when in reality these feelings are developed as a result. I'm not talking about basic, well, perhaps I am talking about basic feelings like empathy towards other people, but our emotions is perhaps a better way to put it. Our emotions are created, are driven by our conditioning. So, to a certain degree, are our assumptions about ourselves. Infants, when they have a caregiver who's perhaps they're taking care of their bodily needs, but isn't really emotionally available, the infant learns not to reach out emotionally to this other person. In contrast, when the child is nurtured and engaged in a loving way, they develop that way of interacting with that person. But if emotions are a result of our conditioning, and our conditioning is a result of our experiences and our conclusions drawn about those experiences, then who is the real person? Who is the real person? This is the core of our practice. Who are we really? In fact, who am I is a fundamental koan. One version of this is show me your face before your parents were born. Show me your face before your parents were born. How the heck do I know what my face was before my parents were born? You can ask intellectually. And it came out of the encounter between the sixth patriarch and the man who was pursuing him and caught up with him, trying to get back the robe and the bowl, which they thought was stolen. And he couldn't lift the robe and the bowl. So he said, really what I came for is the teaching, not the robe and the bowl. And so the sixth patriarch said, let's sit down and do some zazen first, and then I will do some teaching. So they sat zazen for a certain period of time, and then the sixth patriarch said, tell me, when you were pursuing me, thinking of neither good nor evil, where then was your original face? Where then was your original face? And the key to this is thinking neither good nor evil. If emotions are created as a result of conditioning, who are we? Humans come in so many different forms and personalities. Some more let go, some less let go. Some, like the little girl who was so distraught when I touched her, are in deep pain and suffering. There's also a little boy named Leonard. Every morning at that school, we would all come in a group, in lines, of course, everything was organized. And we would stand beside our desks and do calisthenics. Up, down, up, down, and touching our toes and so on and so forth. And this little boy had obviously had a broken arm, and it hadn't healed right, and he could only go like this. He couldn't raise his arm all the way up. That little boy probably as well was abused. We all come to practice through some level of yearning. And then we start practice. And initially, it's just learning how to sit, learning what to do with your breath, learning what to do with your legs, your hands, your posture, and so on. Learning how to manage to sit still for 25 minutes, which is not something most Americans are accustomed to doing, particularly if we have a mind full of thoughts and ideas and conditioning that we want to try to escape from. And yet, we have to sit still unless there's some unusual circumstances, and then we speak with the teacher about that and may or may not get permission to move. Sitting still is important because it requires us to face what we constantly try to run away from. And that's our mind full of thoughts, feelings, ideas, often negative. And this is why Harada Shodo-roshi could say the first 10 years are difficult. Because as we do our practice, the practice is about becoming more clear, letting go where we're caught, and becoming more clear so we can respond to life rather than react out of our conditioning. And the result of that is that most of this has to be seen in order to be let go of. A long time ago, when I was in my first 10 years of challenge, quite extreme challenge actually, practice, I clung to the tale of a woman who had a Kensho experience in Rochester. Back then, Mitra-roshi, whenever anybody had a Kensho experience, he would ask them to write him a letter describing what had happened to him. Sometimes he would read these letters at Teisho. And one letter, this one in particular, was actually published in an early edition of the Zenbo, which is the quarterly journal of the Rochester Zen Center. And in it, this woman had been practicing for some years, and I could definitely relate to this. She had a great deal of resistance to practice, and she was coming to sesshin, and she said she had to virtually nail herself to the mat to keep from running out of the zendo. It was that challenging for her. But she dug in, she faced everything that came up, and towards the end of sesshin, she had a Kensho experience. And this says something that we so often feel that if we're in a difficult mind state, that there's no way we can get Kensho then. but often that's exactly where openings can occur, and certainly where letting go can occur. So she had a kensho, and she wrote afterwards, this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught. First, it shows us where we're caught. Here are those first 10 years, and maybe also the next 10 years. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. Then it sets us free. Each time we become aware of where we're caught, and we tune in, instead of trying to turn away from it or bury it, we move towards it, we open to it, out of curiosity. This is very different from wallowing in it. Out of curiosity, we tune in to the energy of that feeling. And if we tune in deeply enough, that feeling will shift. And it may reveal an underlying feeling that's quite different. For example, we might find ourselves angry about something. And as we tune into the energy of that anger, it could shift, and it may reveal grief underneath, or sadness. And we tune into that one. We keep tuning in until there's nothing more coming up. But again, this is a neutral tuning in. This is not an engaging in the emotion. This is a tuning into the energy of whatever's going on, almost with a scientist's eye. Curious. How does it feel, this anger? How does this feel, this grief? And again, when we really are attentive enough to it in that, I don't want to say platonic, but close to platonic way, it will shift, because we've given it our full attention, not to the story behind it, which would simply keep it recycling, but to the energy of that emotion. And then it dissolves. As we're doing our sitting, things are going to come up. Things that we have buried, sooner or later will start to rise. And that can include experiences of trauma. And it certainly includes just general difficult experiences and painful self-images. And this is why practice can be so challenging in the early years. That's why faith and determination are so vital in practice. When I was first practicing Zen, I came to it basically out of agony. Everything in my life had fallen apart, crashed at my feet. Everything I cared about, everything I identified with, was suddenly gone. And I wanted to die. But I failed at that too. I didn't try, I just was too scared to try, actually. And then somebody handed me a thin little book called The Wheel of Death. So I thought, well, if I can't do it, I can at least read about it. 4 chapters, Death, Dying, Karma, and Rebirth. It's no longer in print, hasn't been in print for decades. A subsequent book is much bigger and much more full by Mitra-roshi, who wrote the original one. And it's not quite the same. It covers some of the same territory, but expands a great deal on it. This was very concise. And in the chapter of dying, I was deeply impressed by the examples that were given of how people were able to face death fearlessly as nothing big deal. And of course, that was not my experience. And I wanted to know what it was that they knew that I didn't know. I read the book cover to cover, and the next morning, January 1st, 1974, sat down, crossed my legs for the first time, and started doing zazen. And for the first year, every time I did that, I burst into tears at what I had lost. But at a certain point, after about a year and a half or so, I realized that what I needed to do was go to sesshin. I was living outside the country at the time, and I applied to sesshin at the Rochester Zen Center, which is the only place I knew. And back then, there were only 4 Zen practice centers in America. There was the Rochester Zen Center, there was San Francisco Zen Center, there was Zen Center of Los Angeles, and there was Diamond Sangha wasn't even a Zen center. It was they had visiting monks who were helping out. Mitra-roshi wasn't a teacher yet. In New York, there was the New York Zen Institute, I think it was called, Soke-an, Japanese monk. And that was it. So I knew of the Rochester Zen Center. The person that had handed me the book, The Wheel of Death, happened to be a member there. And so I applied to sesshin. In those days, you had to apply to a 4-day sesshin and be accepted and satisfy the requirements of attending it before you could apply for a 7-day sesshin with Mitra-roshi. The 4-day sesshins were taught by senior students, and they were not even senior enough to give sanzen or doksan. They gave group instruction. I would gather a group of new people and say, do you have any questions about practice? They were not allowed to assign koans or any of the more advanced practice things. So I went, and all I cared about was surviving the schedule, because I don't do very well with lots of late nights and early mornings. And I survived. It was rugged, but I survived. And the Sunday morning after sesshin ended the Saturday before, I was informal sitting in the zendo, and I sat amazingly for 2 hours without moving, which when I realized it, just floored me. Then I returned to where I was living outside the United States, and could not bring myself to even walk into the room where my mat and cushion were for 3 weeks afterwards. There was so much reactivity. So part of what makes it difficult in the early years is that we have all these issues, because I don't know anybody who comes to Zen practice that doesn't have some level of issues. If life was hunky-dory, if everything was smooth and easy, my motivation is there to practice. No, we come because there's something else going on. And so we face our stuff, but there's another thing that begins to come forth as we get closer to the possibility of Kensho, or Satori if you want to call it that. Kensho literally means seeing into, meaning seeing into the nature of reality, the true nature of reality. And that is that what is at stake in order to have those insights, certainly deep enough insights, to be transformative in our life, we have to see through, at least to a certain level, the self-image that is born of conditioning. And we don't realize how important that self-image is to us wars are started as a result of self-image impingement. People murder each other as a result of self-image impingement. Jealousy is a result of a threat to self-image. Envy, greed, hatred, all of it is born of an attachment to a sense of being somebody that needs to be defended at all costs. And it's so subtle and it's so ingrained that we don't realize how much of a security blanket it is for us. Conditioning happens right from the moment we're born. How people respond to us. We develop a sense of our value or our lack of value, our goodness or our negativity, our qualities, whether we're being honored, whether we're worth honoring, whether we're worth loving, whether we're not worth loving. All of this is a result of our conclusions drawn from how people interact to us from the very beginning. And even if it's a negative self-image, as we can see in the example of women who are in very abusive, violently abusive even, relationships, and they continue to go back again and again to their abuser because they're convinced at some level that they're worthless. So even if we have a negative self-image, that still is a familiar experience. And oddly, we cling to it. Because if we're not who that is, then it can be quite frightening. And this level of fear comes up as our self-image begins to be seen through the practice. A friend of mine, we went to the same session in Mexico many, many years ago, and this is a woman who was a therapist by training, and that was her work. She had a kensho in that session, and she told me afterwards, I honestly thought I was dying. I honestly thought I was dying, and that's what it can feel like. And so there's a great resistance to that. Because even, as I said, even if our self-image is negative, at least it's familiar, and the alternative, to be naked or to disappear, is frightening. And so that's another reason. Those are the two main reasons why Zen practice can be as challenging as it can be for people. But the other side of that coin, as Jacques Lussanon discovered in Buchenwald, living in what was probably the most hellish environment a human being can exist in. And many people were being killed outright in various different bizarre and sadistic ways. They were being ritually starved. And it was too much for him. Finally, with insufficient food and all the strain, and so he was dying. And instead of turning his face to the wall and escaping, instead he tuned in to the physical experience of dying, just as Ramana Maharshi had done when he was a teenager in India. not so long, actually not, I think they were basically contemporaries. And the result for both men was that they found joy. And it was deep and profound and lasting and real, because they had let go that idea that they had to be somebody. Now, in saying this, this is not about a psychological level of being nobody. In order to be healthy psychologically, we have to have a healthy ego. But this is about seeing through the adoption of a self-image that is not a reflection, not a true reflection of who we really are. And when we see through that, even when we begin to see through that, because at a certain point in our Zen practice, if we persist, we will begin to get insights, and we will have moments where things are different in very positive ways for us. This is way before Kensho takes place. And so the quality of our practice begins to shift. We begin to realize that when we turn and face the difficult things, having learned now how to work with them, that they can be let go, and we can become free of them. It may take several sightings of the same thing, but each time, whatever that negative conditioning comes up, is tuned into and felt as a felt sense, then it's weakened. And we begin to see more clearly the reality that it's covering up. And in this way, our practice can unfold. And hopefully it will unfold infinitely until all of you are totally free. Totally free. Thank you for listening, and we'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.